you for everyone that's come out tonight to our microtransit feasibility and fixed route transit service plan design assistance study presentation. That's a mouthful. My name is JB Mack, and I'm a transportation planner at Southwest Region Planning Commission. And one of the roles of the Planning Commission is to take a look at mobility options and accessibility options for residents and workers in the Monadnock region. And as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, we don't have a lot of transit options in the Monadnock region or in New Hampshire for that matter. One of the things that we, when we applied for a planning grant from New Hampshire Department of Transportation, a transit planning grant, we were curious and interested to look at a new type of transit service that is growing in popularity across the country and across the world, including in our our backyard in Montpelier, Vermont, called Microtransit. Cathal O'Gorman and Gal Kramer will be presenting more information about that. I like to think of it as a game changer in terms of providing more convenience to people that need or are interested in using transit. And again, Cathal will explain why. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. And this is the third and last of our public meetings that we're holding on our study. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand or ask any questions that you have. And we're taking notes, so we'll be taking any feedback that you have during the course of the presentation. I'm going to pass it off to Cathal, and I have to apologize. I have to leave at about 6:40 today, but thank you for recording this for us, Cathal.
No problem. Thank you, JB. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Cathal O'Gorman, and as JB mentioned, myself and my colleague Gal have been leading the study for the past several months. Today is an opportunity for us to kind of give you an overview of the project, provide a little bit of a description about what microtransit is, and then to share some of the alternatives, which are basically ideas for transit service. And we'll be walking through all of those. Some are focused on Keene, some are focused on East Monadnock area, and some are in between and all around. So we'll be presenting all of those, and then we'll be kind of laying out what the next steps are for here. Next steps are for this to kind of maybe become reality if that ends up happening, and if people are excited about it, and if the funding is available. So at any point, if you have questions, you can use the chat feature. You all should have access to the chat feature, a little speech bubble in your in the bottom of your screen, and then you also should be able to, I believe you should be able to raise your hand. But if you're not able to raise your hand, just take yourself off mute, and you can say or shout out your question, and I'll pause and give you a chance to ask it. So interrupt at any time if you have a question. Before I get going, are there any questions? Great. So just an overview of the project and how it's worked. So we started by looking at a lot of data, things like census data, existing public transit ridership and volunteer transportation services to see where people are currently traveling and where we think people would want to travel as well, because where people live and where people work are often good predictors of where you need public transportation. We then actually came up with a first round of ideas for new or changes to the existing transit service, and we actually did a first round of public meetings, and that was in the summer. We then went away, we thought about those a bit more, we refined them, and we actually went and ran simulations to kind of work out how much are these going to cost, how many people do we think are going to use them. And right now what we're doing is we're kind of presenting our recommendations and developing an implementation plan. And the next step will be just to write this up into a report, deliver it to JB, and that will be public. That will be available on the Southwest Region Planning Commission website. And after that, it's really a matter of applying for funding and trying to get some of these services up and running. So as JB mentioned, some of the services that we are talking about today are your normal bus, basically. So a bus that runs on a schedule, it has a timetable, it has stops along the way, and you hop on and you hop off. You don't need to book it in advance. And we've got some ideas that are a little bit different from a bus. And sometimes it's called microtransit. Sometimes it's called on-demand transportation or on-demand transit. Or sometimes it's even called something like dial-a-ride, but dial-a-ride has been around for decades. And this new, all that's really changed is the technology behind it has improved. And that means that you can book using a smartphone app and things like that. So today, this is becoming more and more of a popular transportation, a form of public transportation. And so I wanted to kind of explain a little bit about what it is. Basically, what microtransit is a public transportation service. So anyone can use it. You don't need to have a disability. You don't need to be a senior. Anyone can use it. Teenagers, people can use it to get to work. And the way it works is you can travel anywhere within a zone. So you'll see in some of the slides that I'll be presenting, for example, we have a zone that covers Greater Keene. So that's Keene and Marlborough and Swanzey, and you can travel anywhere within that zone. So you could start your trip in downtown Keene, and you could end your trip at the Market Basket, or you could go the other direction. As long as your trip starts and ends within the zone, you can do it. You usually can request the trip in real time. So basically, when you're ready to travel, you request it, and then you get picked up in about 10 to 25 minutes from when you request it. You might be asked to walk to meet the vehicle. So it's not necessarily going to pick you up right outside your door unless you have a disability. And the walks are pretty short. They might just be out to the main road, or just like 1 block or something like that to meet the vehicle. Typically, it's like a 2 or a 3 or a 4 minute walk. Another big part of it is that it's shared. So that means that if there are other people traveling in the same direction, let's say you're going from the north of Keene down to Market Basket, and there's some other people in the town center going to Market Basket, they'll get also picked up along the way and taken with you and dropped off at the same time. So that's why it's public transportation. And the other reason why it's public transportation is because it's subsidized. So you would only pay a normal bus fare. Right now, the bus fares are roughly $1, and we're not proposing to change those fares at all, or much at all. So it's still only going to be $1 or 50 cents or $2 to ride, depending on if you qualify for concession or you buy a month pass or something like that. The big difference is also you must book to travel. So you must either use a smartphone and download the app, and it might be called something like the Keene on Demand or something like that. And so you download that app, you'd go in, you'd request the trip, you'd say, I'm in Keene town center, and I want to go to Market Basket. You'd hit request a ride, and it would give you a proposal and say, okay, the vehicle can come, it's going to pick you up at the transit center in 11 minutes, and you accept, and then you go and you hop on the vehicle. Some people aren't obviously going to have a smartphone or know how to use a smartphone, and so for those people, you can call up a phone number and you can speak with a real person. That person's probably going to be based in Keene, and they will take your booking for you. So I want to pause there and I want to make sure everyone kind of understands this concept. Are there any questions? Yes, Dory.
I'm sure that you're just using Keene as an example, but as someone who lives on the other side of the Monadnock region in Peterborough, is there any microtransit that you're going to be proposing for that area?
Yes, so I will walk you through the alternatives a bit later, but yes, there
Okay.
is an alternative that has microtransit in the Peterborough area. The big difference with the services I'm proposing outside of Keene is that there's probably going to be, because there's less people and it's lower density, you would probably have to book in advance. So it might only be 2 or 3 hours in advance or something like that, but you'd have to go in and pre-schedule your trip. So you might say, it might be Monday night and you want to use it on Tuesday. So you might go in on Monday night and say, I want to be picked up between 9 and 9:30 and taken down to the Walmart in Rindge. And you'd book that and it would say, okay, I'll come get you tomorrow at 9:30. And the reason why it's not on demand is because if there's only, let's say, 2 vehicles covering that whole area, and you go in and request a trip and that vehicle just happened to leave Peterborough to go south, it might not be back for like an hour. And so that's pretty annoying if you don't know until the last minute if your pickup's going to be 10 minutes away or 1 hour away. So in those cases, we recommend a pre-booked microtransit service.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the question. Does anyone else have any questions? Great. Well, raise your hand if you do as we move along. But I just wanted to highlight one example. So this is GMT My Ride in Montpelier, Vermont. And so this is an example of a microtransit service. And so what it's showing here is the app, but of course they also have a call center and a dispatcher if you don't use the app. And so you can see the first screen is just what it looks like when you download it and you log in or create a profile. And then the second one shows you where you can travel. So it kind of shows that zone and you can travel anywhere within that zone. You can kind of zoom in and zoom out to understand exactly the boundaries. Then you type in your origin and your destination and it will give you a proposal. It'll say, okay, we can come pick you up. We're 13 minutes away, and it will show you exactly where to meet the vehicle. And then once you book, you can actually track your ride in real time. So it's very similar. If you've ever used Uber, it's very similar to that. You can see the vehicle driving along the road and you can track it. So you know exactly when you need to go out and meet it, and you can make sure that you don't miss the vehicle. If you're paying through the app, you can also have your credit card saved, so it just automatically subtracts the $1 or whatever from your credit card. I know I talked a little bit about this before, but in dense areas, we recommend on demand. And that basically means you go in, you request a trip, and it says, okay, 5 minutes away or 10 minutes away, and you can book it right there and there. In a pre-booked service, you go in and you say, I want to leave on Tuesday, 21st of April between 5 and 5:15 a.m. And that window probably will be about 30 minutes, or sometimes it can be as much as an hour. But the good thing is once you book, it gives you a 15-minute window afterwards or something like that. So you might say, I'm willing to travel between 9 a.m. or I must arrive at my doctor's appointment by 10 a.m. So you put the window of 9 to 10 a.m. and maybe it just happens that that vehicle is coming past at 9:15. So then it will say, okay, we'll pick you up at 9:15 and we'll get you there by your 10 o'clock appointment. And that, as I said, this version, the pre-booked, works better in much lower density areas where there are not as many vehicles. So basically in Keene, the on-demand will work, and pretty much everywhere else, we would recommend a pre-booked service. Are there any questions about that? Great. So now I'm going to talk through some of the different alternatives, and these are kind of focused around 3 different areas. So I'm going to present them all, and then you're invited to kind of share your thoughts on which ones you like the most. But I'm going to start with the focus on Keene. I'm then going to talk about some Winchester options, then some options that are focused on East Monadnock area, and then a few others at the end. So I know some of you are here from different areas and you all are probably interested in different ones. So I'll try and give equal time to each. But if you have questions, again, just raise your hand or type in the chat. So the first one is a Greater Keene Microtransit service. And essentially what this is you can travel anywhere within Keene, North Swanzey, West Swanzey, East Marlborough. So that zone that you see on the map there in the red, the orange, you can travel anywhere within that zone. And you can start your trip anywhere within the zone and end your trip anywhere within the zone. And so this includes things like the Market Basket, the center of Keene, of course. It kind of goes up Cheshire Medical Center, West Swanzey, Swanzey Town Hall, Marlborough Town Centre, all these hotspots, but anywhere else as well. So someone's house, I just don't know, obviously I can't list every address. So these are hotspots, but you don't have to travel to these hotspots. You can travel to anywhere. And if this service was, in this particular alternative, the assumption is if this happens, the red and the black bus routes that are currently operated by HCS would no longer operate. So this would be instead of the bus routes, and this would be instead of the friendly bus as well, because this provides essentially the same service as the friendly bus. And if you had a disability or you were a senior, you could still get that door-to-door service exactly like you do, and you could still call up and speak to the same person to book it. So it's very similar to what currently exists, but it basically means everything's part of one system now. Does anyone have any questions about the Greater Keene Microtransit alternative? Okay, I will carry on. The next alternative is a bus alternative. So instead of microtransit, this is back to kind of the bus system that you know and are familiar with, where there's a timetable and a schedule. And so what we're proposing here is actually really similar to the red and the black bus routes that currently operate in Keene. We've just kind of changed it a little bit. And the way it would work is there'd be one bus going clockwise around this route and one bus going anti-clockwise. And so in each direction, the bus is going once an hour, but depending on where you are, the bus might come past roughly on average once every 30 minutes in each of the two directions. And so this kind of covers, it goes through the center of Keene, it goes past the transportation center, it covers some of the kind of neighborhoods a little bit to the east of Keene, and then it goes down to the Walmart. It goes to the West Street Plaza and then all the way up and around and back to Cheshire Medical Center and kind of loops around. So it's very similar to the existing bus service. And behind this service is the assumption that the friendly bus, which exists for people who can't use this because they might have a disability or something like that, that would continue to operate. So in the previous one, the microtransit service, I said there'd be no friendly bus, but in this option, there would be, the friendly bus would still exist. Does anyone have any questions about this alternative? Nope. All right. Oh, sorry, Mike, I see you've got a question.
Yes, I assume this circular bus route option is on a timetable, so people would know approximately when it's going to be at each stop.
Exactly, yeah. So there'd be a published timetable, just like the current bus route.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And you wouldn't have to book. So with a traditional bus service, you can just hop on and hop off. You don't need to book at all. Whereas with a microtransit service, you can't just hop on because that vehicle might be booked to go somewhere entirely different. And so you might want to go north and it's going south. So unless you book, you won't know. And that's why the microtransit service must be booked. The next option is actually a different version of a bus route. We took a look. The previous option is very similar to what currently happens, and this is an entirely new bus route, and it's actually two bus routes. So the green line shows a north-south bus route, and that starts at the Market Basket, goes up past the Walmart, goes through the center of Keene, and then up to the medical center, and then all the way up kind of along Maple Ave. That would run every 30 minutes in each direction. And then in addition, there would be an east-west bus route, which is this orange one. And so that would actually be timed. So in the center of Keene, those buses would arrive at the same time, and they'd go every 30 minutes. And so you could transfer and hop on one to the other. So you could go kind of east and west. And so it basically covers a lot of the same destinations as the other bus route, but it also goes all the way down to Market Basket, which we know is kind of a big destination for people. This would require one more bus, so it's a little bit more expensive than the previous option that I showed you, but it does provide kind of nice direct trips. If you're going from one end of Keene to the other, you don't have to circle round and round. You kind of get this nice direct trip from the north to the south or the east to the west. And again, we're assuming the friendly bus would continue to operate for anyone who is not able to use a bus. Any questions on this one? All right, so we will carry on. The last option for Keene is kind of a hybrid. So remember that microtransit zone that I showed you, the first alternative? This is basically the same. So it's the same microtransit zone, and it also includes that north-south bus route that we talked about on the previous slide. And so the way this one would work, and Mark, I'll come back and answer your question in a moment, but the way this one would work is if you are traveling along this main corridor, which is where most of the trips happen, in the center of Keene and Walmart and Market Basket and kind of the medical center, that's really like the busiest corridor. So if you're traveling along that busy corridor, you can just use the bus. You can hop on, hop off exactly how you would. For anyone else, you can use the microtransit service. So you just book through the app. And if you're not sure, you can just try and book through the app, and the app will actually tell you, hey, for your trip, you can use the bus, because the bus is, and it might even tell you, it might even show you exactly when the bus is coming and where the bus stop is. And it could even show you the bus in real time. And then for everyone else, you just have that normal microtransit experience that we talked about before. So are there any questions about the hybrid option? That's microtransit and a bus route. And then Mark, I'm going to answer your question on the next slide. Great. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide, which is kind of a summary of all the Keene options. And you can see here in the first column, we do have demand estimates. And I know that Mark asked the question, like, how did we come up with our demand estimates? And so it's kind of based on two things. So number one, it's sort of based on the existing ridership on the friendly bus and the existing bus routes. So they're doing about 170 trips per day. And so for that option, the circulator bus route and the friendly bus, which is very similar, we think you do about 200 trips per day. And that's mostly driven by longer service hours. So we're proposing this would run an hour or two later in the evening. And so that's where that extra ridership comes from. And then for some of these other ones, because we're covering more areas and there's more people who live close to a bus stop or more people live in a microtransit zone, we've kind of modeled how many of them we think are going to use the service based on how much additional service we're providing. And so that's where you can kind of see that we think that ridership might grow to kind of 200 or 300 trips a day. So it could be as much as like a 50% rise in ridership in the best case scenario, or even 100% if you're thinking if you can get all the way up to 300 rides per day, that's nearly double what you're doing now. But at the same time, what you're doing now, the ridership is, for a city the size of Keene, it's actually not that high. So I don't think these numbers are crazy at all. And Gal and I, we work on these kind of projects all around the country. And I think these are pretty realistic demand estimates for somewhere like Keene, where we have kind of 25,000 people in the zone. Hopefully that answers your question, Mark. Does anyone have any other questions? As you can see, the costs for these services, they vary a bit, around 1.2 to $2 million a year. The current service is costing about $0.7 million per year. But the big difference here is these ones all assume weekend service. So we're kind of planning for the best case scenario that hopefully there's some federal funding, there's some state funding that we can get, some local funding from your cities, councilors and mayors and things like that. Of course, if that's not possible, these changes could still happen, but just on Monday to Friday, and that would reduce these costs by around 15 to 20%. So all those numbers would go down if we don't operate on weekends. And as you can see, the cost per trip goes up a little bit, and that's mostly because of inflation. So as costs have continued to rise, we're kind of seeing everything, fuel and driver hours and things like that are going up. So that's one of the reasons for the costs going up a little bit, and also just running on weekends and things like that tends to add costs as well. Of course, it also adds ridership, but not quite at the same level. Weekends tend to be a little bit quieter. So does anyone have any questions on this slide? I'm going to move on from the Keene alternatives after this. So if anyone has questions about Keene, now's a good time. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about Winchester. And I see one or two of you on here that maybe are interested in Winchester. So hopefully these are interesting for you. So there are two Winchester options. There is a bus route that runs from Chester Medical Center through the center of Keene, down through West Swanzey and into Winchester. And we've planned this out to run once every 2 hours, roughly. The other option is a microtransit service that connects Winchester and kind of anywhere along the corridor near the road between Winchester and Keene, you can request the trip. And this would be a door-to-door service, so you wouldn't have to walk to a bus stop. It would pick you up right where you are. Whereas in the bus route option, you would have to walk out to the main road and flag the bus down, or in Winchester, go to one of kind of the established bus stops along the way. So two different options here, a pre-booked microtransit service or a bus route that runs between. And kind of to summarize these two here, we think the microtransit service would have more ridership than the bus route. And that's just because it's easier to get to, you don't have to walk to it. And we know that like some of these areas, there are no sidewalks, especially along the road in the middle. And so it's a little bit hard to get to the vehicle. And in the winter with snowbanks and things, it can kind of be tough. So we think that the microtransit service would have more ridership, but we also think it would require a second vehicle and cost roughly double as much. So it's kind of a trade-off. They both cost about the same amount per trip, but one of them is going to have more ridership and more cost to operate. Of course, remember, cost is how much it costs the city. But in terms of as a rider, you don't pay this. You don't pay $24 per trip. You're going to still pay like just a few dollars because, as I said, all public transportation is subsidized. And so these costs are really more numbers that the planners and your local leaders and elected officials care about because they have to kind of find the funding to operate these services. Are there any questions about the Winchester alternatives? Okay, well, raise your hand if anything comes up and we will move on to East Monadnock. And so in the East Monadnock area, we have two options. So the first one is a Keene to Peterborough bus route. So it starts at the Chester Medical Center, goes through Keene. It also stops in Marlborough, Dublin, goes into Peterborough, and then kind of heads north to the hospital and kind of some of the apartments and complexes a little bit north of Peterborough as well. And so this would run a little under every 2 hours. So if you're traveling, there'd be like an 8 a.m. departure, and 9:45, like a 10:30, that kind of timing. Every 2 hours. So 8 a.m., 10 a.m., 12 p.m., that kind of thing in each direction. The other option is kind of like an East Monadnock microtransit service. And so it's this yellow shaded area, and you could travel anywhere within this yellow shaded area. So if you were in Peterborough, you could book a ride down to Rindge. If you were at the Franklin Pierce University, you could book a ride into Rindge or to some of these like big retailers or Walmart down here as well. If you're in Jaffrey, you could go up to Peterborough. What you couldn't do is book a ride into Keene. So this, you have to start and end, just a reminder, you have to start and end within the zone. And so this one would kind of, and it would be door to door. So basically they pick you up right outside where you are and take you to where you're going. Of course, you'd share along the way with anyone else traveling in the same direction, and it would need to be pre-booked. And as I mentioned earlier, that's because there's only going to be a few vehicles covering a really big area, and so you need to book it in advance. And so here's a summary of the two options. So we think the bus route between Keene and Peterborough will have about 50 users per day, and it requires one vehicle, one bus to go back and forth every 2 hours. The East Monadnock Microtransit service probably requires 2 vehicles, and we think it will have about 30 or 40 trips per day is our medium demand estimate. And so you can see it's quite expensive to operate per trip, and that's just because it's a low density area. There's not that many people and it's pretty spread out. And so those trips tend to be long and take a fair bit of time to complete. So I'm going to pause here. Does anyone have any questions about the East Monadnock alternatives? Yes, Dory.
So I'm a little confused about the alternatives in the different places, because it seems like in Keene, there were alternatives that basically served the same area. Whereas in the East Monadnock area, the two alternatives are completely different. They serve very different areas. And so I don't really see them as alternatives, because it's not like they both have the same goal. They both have very different goals.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I think you're right. In Keene, you wouldn't choose like 2 of the alternatives. You just do one of them. But you could do one of the Keene alternatives and one of the Winchester alternatives, and you could potentially do one or both of the East Monadnock alternatives. And in fact, they could probably complement each other quite well, right? You could have the bus route running, and you could potentially have this microtransit service kind of providing service in East Monadnock as well. And so I think at this stage, we don't really know if it would be one of them or both of them. A lot of it really does depend on funding, but I agree with you. These could both happen, and they're not really like substitutes for each other. And what I think we're interested in hearing from people like yourself is if you had to choose, because of course one of the big challenges is how much money would be available. I'd love to hear, if you had to choose between the 2 of them, which one would you think would be more useful for the East Monadnock community?
I personally think it would be more useful to be able to get to Keene. When I'm going someplace bigger, I guess, yeah, it's kind of to go someplace bigger, as opposed to, to go to Jaffrey or Rindge. I don't have a lot of call to go to Jaffrey or Rindge, but that's just me.
Got it. And then can I ask, are you more in the Peterborough area?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Oh, I think it's important to let Dory know about previous scenarios that we looked at. Why, for example, we didn't look at a Peterborough to Keene microtransit, and did we look at another alternative for the Eastern Monadnock region?
Yeah, so I'll answer that, and then I'll go to Anne's question after. So we did, Dory, we did actually have a bus route that kind of ran up and down this corridor, so from Peterborough down to Rindge. And what we heard was that, one, this area is just not very walkable, and so getting to the bus route would have been nearly impossible for a lot of people, unless the bus kind of went down all these side streets and kind of went into Rindge and then back to the main road and then went to Franklin Pierce University. And so you can imagine it would have got to be a very long bus route and we basically concluded that it wasn't worth exploring further at this stage. It just didn't seem like a very promising option to run this bus route north-south along this corridor. We also looked at, we discussed, what if we did like a microtransit service that kind of covered this entire area? But basically, one of the reasons that we kind of are sort of experts when it comes to these microtransit services, and this long linear route, it's very big by the time you start stretching all the way from Keene to Peterborough. And a lot of the destinations along this route are actually along the main road. So like if you go to Dublin, there's not too much, at least, or Peterborough as well. A lot of things are walking distance to this main road. And we just we know that if you do a microtransit service that covers this whole area, it will just be very, very expensive, and it's not a great, a bus route would be a better fit for this kind of long linear corridor. So that's kind of why we eliminated that microtransit option.
Okay, thank you. That was a good explanation. Thank you.
No problem. Anne, I see you've got your hand raised. And you just remember to go off mute if you're speaking, because it looks like there you are.
When I look at this, I live at Rivermead, which is a retirement community, and there are lots of people who can't drive. And you know, I think I would favor the microtransit locally. I mean, we could get downtown, we could get to the library, we could, you know, and Rivermead has some transportation, but it's scheduled and it goes specific places at specific times of the week. And it would be, I've just been in Australia, in Brisbane, taking an Uber wherever I wanted to go anywhere, and it was so nice. You can see where it is and when it's going to be there, and you can also schedule ahead. It just and the software is very good at directing the drivers so that they go to the next stop that's near them. And we scheduled one for early in the morning to get to the airport, and the driver said they'd given him a few little rides in that area before the schedule because you know, the software was just very good at not sending him all over the place and then back to where we were.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really helpful comment, Anne, and I definitely think it depends who you ask, right? Some people really like the bus to Keene, and some people like the more local service within East Monadnock. And I mean, I think we all agree the ideal answer is both, right? Like,
yes, I would like
it is.
I would like to be able to get to Keene sometimes.
And so I think one of the big challenges with this study in general is what is going to be able to be funded. And so this study might be more, it might lay out some like steps, right? So it might be like, first we do this, then when we have enough funding or the ridership grows, or hopefully over time, I think there's a general movement in the United States to better fund public transportation. And so over time, now we have this plan, and maybe this is like step 2 or step 3, but I don't know. I think right now there probably needs to be some more conversations in East Monadnock about which of those 2 alternatives, if you had to choose, which one it would be. But yeah, I think hearing your input and hearing that both are interesting to different people is also very useful. So thank you.
Can I piggyback on what Anne was saying?
Yes.
And I didn't think about the idea of using it for within Peterborough. And yeah, I was thinking about it, you know, going from Peterborough to Rindge or Jaffrey. And so thank you for reminding me of that, because that could be a help for the renewable energy plan.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's good. And also the whole idea of teenagers going places, you know, going from school to the coffee shop or whatever,
right,
be very useful.
So that increases my interest in this option, because I don't think that many people will necessarily use, well, I don't know, and use it to go to those other 2 destinations, but within Peterborough, I could see that it could be very helpful.
Yeah.
And welcome back. I
Thank
haven't
seen you yet.
Well, thank you both for the comments. That's really helpful. And I'm just going to respond to 2 comments in the chat. So I know Mark asked, can a major ride generator like a large business buy in to expand the service zone or vehicle stop? And I think the answer is yes. So we definitely have seen those situations. There's a service I've worked with in Park City in Utah, where one of the big kind of like skiing resort facilities kind of gave a lot of funding to the transit system on the condition that they got better transit service, and there was microtransit that was kind of covering their place of employment. So that's definitely possible. I think a lot of the times the way these things work is if a big business kind of was to go to the city of Keene, or if that business was based in Marlborough, go to the city of Marlborough and say like, hey, we'd be willing to kind of fund this service, or we want to see our taxpayer dollars go towards the service. That can kind of help make this happen as well. And then you can definitely do things like, if a trip starts or ends at my business, I'll pay for it. Like you can, because you have the exact origins and destinations, you can kind of do voucher codes, or you can give out employee passes, and all of those things are definitely possible. And it kind of, what we found in reality is a lot of businesses love the idea and are enthusiastic, but like often won't necessarily want to fund each individual trip themselves, but they will kind of encourage their elected officials to kind of use taxpayer dollars to fund a service like this. So it can be either or. I see that Bobby asked that, or Bobby suggested that the bus could go in, so rather than kind of going up Main Street, it could go up Optical Ave here. And I know that it's a great point, Bobby. There are a lot of kind of employers along that Optical Ave area, some kind of industrial facilities as well. And so that could be a better way to go into Keene. And it is also roughly the same travel time. So we'll definitely note that down and have that as an alternate suggestion for the route. And I think at this stage, the goal of this project is like to roughly develop the costs and estimates and help to prioritize between all these different services. But before any of these are launched, there'd probably need to be some really detailed planning. Where is the bus going to pull in? How many shifts are you going to do? Exactly what the timetable will look like. And that's kind of like a next step, but we'll definitely note that down because I think that's a great suggestion. So thanks, Bobby. Are there any other questions before I move on to the last few alternatives? Okay, so the final two alternatives are a Keene to Brattleboro bus route. So starts in the center of Keene. It actually stops with some major employers along this route as well in West Chesterfield, and then goes into Brattleboro, into the center of Brattleboro, and into the Amtrak station and things like that as well. And that would run roughly every hour and a half in each direction. And we think this would be important for people in Keene to get to Brattleboro for work and things like that, but also the other direction. So some people in Brattleboro work in Keene. We know that Keene's a big employment center. And the other option is one we wanted to explore. The short answer is it's not really feasible, but this would basically be like an entire study-wide microtransit service. And so you can see this is everywhere that we were kind of asked to look at in this study. This would have to be like a very low quality of service. So it wouldn't, if you wanted to just like, if you want to go from somewhere in the north into Keene, you might only get one option a day. You might get, yes, we'll come and pick you up at 9 a.m. and we'll take you home at 4 p.m. And it's not like you can just get picked up in 10 or 20 or 30 minutes. It's just such a big area and so many people. And so that would definitely be a real challenge. And I think when you kind of look at the results, you can see that it would require 7 vehicles as our rough estimate. And it's very rough because it's kind of just such a new service for so many people. It would be the most expensive service that we kind of identified. And so that big region-wide one is probably like a long-term thing, maybe, but not likely to be feasible in the short term. Whereas the Keene to Brattleboro bus would only require one bus and could be operated quite effectively. And I do see Dory suggesting that the Keene to Brattleboro and the Peterborough to Keene bus would kind of hook up. So you could go all the way from Peterborough to Keene and into Brattleboro. And I think that's also a great suggestion. And as I said, right now, I don't think anyone's kind of worked out if we can fund how many of these different alternatives can be funded and which ones happen first. But it definitely makes sense that if the Keene to Peterborough bus route and the Keene to Brattleboro bus route end up both happening, of course, it makes a lot of sense to have those kind of time in the middle so that you can, or even just have it as one really long bus route so that people can go all the way from one end to the other. and get to the Amtrak and be able to get to other places. So I definitely think, Dory, that's a great suggestion that if they both happen, that should be a kind of condition that they time to meet each other. Those were actually all the alternatives. So I wanted to pause for questions. Colin, I see you have your hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, yeah, I'm the my name's Colin. I'm the transportation planner for the Wyndham Regional Commission. We're over on the other side of the river in southeastern Vermont. I'm based in Brattleboro and serving Wyndham County, Vermont. And I just wanted to say that we're very supportive of having some transit connection to Keene and Brattleboro. That it's something that's identified in a lot of our regional planning documents and transit goals and all that stuff. That we think this is a particularly important missing connection for the region. And I think that if there was some momentum on the New Hampshire side, that Vermont would likely be very happy to to get involved and be supportive of that.
That's great to hear, Colin. I know that Vermont is blessed with a lot more funding as well than New Hampshire, unfortunately, and so I know that you guys are kind of used to a lot more transit, but I definitely think there is a lot of excitement about this Keene to Brattleboro bus route, and I think that I definitely know that I know JB had to drop off this call, but we've got Terry here from Southwest Region Planning. But I know that there is definitely an interest in working with folks from Vermont to try and work out how to fund this in the future. So thanks for sharing.
Yes, no, we welcome that, absolutely. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any final comments before I just quickly present the next steps? Okay, so in terms of the next steps, this is roughly where our recommendation is. And I think that all of this is so dependent on funding. And if there's a lot of funding, let's say that we're able to get some big grants and some significant federal funding, I think 1 and 2 could maybe happen at the same time, but it's kind of a way of like showing prioritization. And so what we're suggesting is Keene already has a public transit service. It already has the friendly bus and the bus routes. And so we think that changing those up a little bit and kind of not necessarily even spending that much more, but just spending the dollars more wisely in Keene and probably implementing one of the microtransit or microtransit hybrid bus routes makes the most sense and could really help to grow and improve transportation in Keene. And so our first recommendation is kind of try and fix up the existing, try and invest in and improve the existing transit service in Keene, and then introduce and test out the microtransit technology, and then look at expanding to Winchester and East Monadnock. And so that would be potentially the bus routes, but also some of the microtransit services, those pre-scheduled microtransit services. And then we kind of had the regional services as a third step. I think something that has sort of come up a lot in this project is the interest in the Brattleboro bus route and how kind of transformational that could be. So I think after these conversations, we'll probably suggest the Brattleboro bus route would kind of be part of phase 2 instead of phase 3. And then that regional microtransit one is sort of much less likely to happen in the future. Of course, as I said, all of this really, the big question now is, how are we going to fund this? Because it is going to require significantly more funding. And the good news is there are we're working with the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. There are a lot of big federal grants to do with congestion and air quality. And there's just more funding in general for public transit. So we're kind of excited, and we think that we will be able to get more funding for some of these services, but it's definitely going to take some time to get up and going. I do see a comment from Dory saying that because Keene has some transit, it makes it more important to get things started in other areas first. I think that's definitely another way of looking at it, Dory, and I think we could argue both ways on that one. Basically, one of the challenges here is that HCS, which currently operates the service in Keene, is kind of really interested in improving the service that they currently operate. And so it wouldn't necessarily even require more funding. They kind of want to use the study, and because they're already there, they're already operating a service, they can actually make these changes really quickly. And so that's kind of why the Keene one is likely to happen first, because they're going to use the study potentially to make that happen really quickly. Whereas expanding to these new areas is going to require new funding, and that's just going to take a little bit longer to apply for those grants and to kind of get the money. So that's kind of the reason why those ones were put first. It's also just that to expand, we are going to need to get funding, and that's not something that's going to happen by like next month. It's going to require a bit more time. The federal grants tend to take a couple of months, or sometimes, unfortunately, even as long as a year or so. So from here, we are going to prepare the draft and final report. So that will be ready in about a month from now, and that will be shared with anyone who kind of joined these calls. If we have your email, which we do for I think everyone on this call, and then that will also be on the Southwest Region Planning Commission website. And then we're going to work with HCS, who currently operates the bus services in Keene, and Southwest Region Planning Commission and all the other stakeholders to try and actually make this happen and get the funding. And so funding is, as I said, that's the big challenge here. This project is all about working out what's feasible. And then from there, we can then, once we get the funding, it's really, then it becomes kind of very implementation focused. So putting out signage and telling people about the changes and advertising and all of those things. So that's kind of then the final step. And then of course, implementing it. And I do see Bobby says, what kind of funding would local governments be expected to contribute? So the way it works is that the federal government can provide somewhere around 50% of transit operating costs, and it can be as high as 80% depending on the funding source. So that means for every local dollar, you could get as many as $4 from the federal government. And so there still does need to be local funding. And right now, for example, pretty much the only local funding comes from HCS. So they have, they're kind of subsidize the transit service from their own operations. And they do have some philanthropy as well. And then the city of Keene also currently is giving, I believe, almost $100,000 to operate the service as well, which is kind of why to date, a lot of the transit has focused on Keene. It's because the city of Keene is the only kind of municipality who's actually providing funding. I think that it would be great, and we have been working with folks from Swanzey and Marlborough, but if this service does expand to some of these new areas, I do think that some of these local governments may have to kind of chip in some local funding. And as I said, it might be as little as 20% of the funding comes from locally, and that means you can get 4 times more funding from the federal government. But that's roughly how it works. And it's very complicated, like everything, and it depends on exactly what the funding source is. What about the state? Unfortunately, the state of New Hampshire does not really fund public transportation in any meaningful way. It's one of the few states that doesn't do it. So for example, across the border in Vermont, they really heavily invest in public transit. Unfortunately, New Hampshire does not. I mean, you're welcome to kind of, over the long term, hopefully that will change. But what New Hampshire does do is it funnels and manages the federal money. So New Hampshire DOT helps the funding to be allocated within the state, but as in terms of New Hampshire taxes actually funding transit, that doesn't really happen very much. This is actually the last slide, so it's really just open question and answer now if anyone has any final questions. Or just comments in general. It doesn't have to be a question. If you want to kind of say your final words before you drop off about what excites you or what you'd like to see most, you're welcome to kind of say that before you drop off. Thanks, Mark. Well, excellent. I thank you again to everyone who joined. I'll stay on the line a little bit afterwards if anyone does have any last questions, but I think we can kind of wrap the meeting up here, and I really appreciate you joining. If you do have any questions, feel free to send through an email or let JB know or reach out to Southwest Region Planning Commission, and we'll definitely make sure to get back to you. But thank you so much for joining.